This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn and I are delighted to have Scott James back with us at the Roundtable. Scott James is a poet and a publishing guide. Yes. Today we are going to talk about using reader feedback to improve your writing. And Scott, I know you're bringing some specific thoughts to us and some guidelines. So let me throw it right over to you. Can we start with defining terms? We're going to be talking about beta readers and also ARC, or advanced reader copy readers. Mm-hmm. So I'll let you bring us up to speed with that.
Sure. Good to be here again. Hello, everyone. And yeah, basically beta readers, whenever I work with people as a guide and help them put together a book independently, one of the biggest challenges is sort of getting over that hump of the fear of other people's opinions. And when is the right time? So I like to do two formal feedback asks for, and the first one I call beta readers, and basically that means 3 to 5 or 6 people actually before hiring your first editor. So I like to ask for beta reader feedback before. Maybe you can work with a developmental editor, but certainly early in the process. And I like to do it very early on because the beta readers are almost certainly going to be people that you know. So that's a beta reader. Early, once you're done with your draft, but you haven't, you have unresolved high-level questions, dev editor type questions. And then the other one, the ARCs, or advanced reader copies, I like to use either digital, or if you can get low-cost print ones, during the proofread is nice, or after the proofread, to send to 20 or more, depending on how ambitious you are, in order to get people, 6 to 8 weeks before your book launches, so that you can invite those 20 plus people to go review your book the day that it comes out. So those are the two ways that basically independent authors, but really any author, but specifically independent authors, really make the most of supportive network.
Right. So when writers send those manuscripts out to the early readers, the early beta readers, who you said are people they know, so friends and family type of readers, isn't there the risk of not getting honest critical feedback because they know you, because they don't want to hurt your feelings, or maybe you ask them because you can ask a favor of them, but they never read your genre, they never, so how do you ensure you get good quality feedback from that sort of a reader at that stage?
Yeah, that's the rub. But the way that I think about it is it needs to be someone that's in the target reader group. So I wouldn't ask, my mother for feedback as a beta reader, unless my book was for, retired awesome women. But, it's probably not. So I'm not going to ask for her opinion about it. So that's the first thing, is they have to be people who are legitimately in. And sometimes that's not your friends or your family. Sometimes it's friends of friends, or it's someone that you worked with 10 years ago. So you can be connected to someone and not get sort of, in the muck of, this is my friend and their job or their role in my life is to make me, feel good, or to give me honest emotional support, but they really don't read books. You still want someone who is in the target reader group. So definitely that. And if it's your first book and you're fiction, but also not either way, if it's a first book, that can be harder to find. But it's also why I limit it to, 3 people, 4 people. So I do find that I've never had anyone not be able to do it. And if someone is not able to do it, to me, it's a red flag. Not like there's something wrong with that person, but it means that finishing the book and putting it out in the world and doing any kind of marketing is going to be so painful that, that is a thing that needs to be dealt with way up front before we write this book, because that's its own thing. So I find that it is a challenge, to get people to agree. And I frequently have to, I'll frequently have clients say like, I can't believe they didn't do it. They told me they would do it. And it's 4 weeks later and they didn't do it. This is my cousin or this is my friend, why didn't, and they're like, it's kind of a hard thing to process that this friend didn't read or this connection that they thought, would for sure do it. So there, it gets a little thorny. But the way that I get around that is to make sure they're in the target reader group and to send specific questions. So I would never send it to someone and just say, let me know what you think. So I have a list of 12 questions that I ask people or that I suggest that people use for these beta readers. And they're not hard questions. And I believe that they allow people to be honest without being cruel. So those are the 2 ways that I get around that.
Nice. Yeah. Before we ask you about the questions, at what stage is a writer's manuscript? You have to be emotionally ready to put your work in somebody else's hand and accept feedback. But at what stage, how do you know the writer's manuscript is ready to be viewed by somebody other than the writer or a peer critique, like a writing group or a professional editor? What if it is just not reader ready, and then you maybe burn a bridge with a given reader, somebody who might be a fan later on if they hadn't been exposed too soon?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And there's no perfect answer to that. The way that I think about that question is, if you're wondering, if it's finished, and all right, if you've written all of the words that are in it, like if you think if it's a fiction, if it's a story and the story is all the way through, there's not like sections that are still open. There's not bullet points, or there's not, fill this in later. And you're starting to wonder, I wonder if this is good. Like you start to have that voice like, is this any good? Are people is this going to embarrass me? Are people going to, if it's that instead of, man, I wonder what my character is going to do. What should I put in that section? Those questions are peer review, work with a writing coach, work with, keep working on it. But once it is, to me, completed and you're starting to wonder, is this any good? I wonder if people will like this. That's when I think it's time, and a lot of times people wonder, is this too long? Should the character have done, should I have the character do that? Like they go on this whole sort of tangent in chapter 8 through 12. Is that any good? So if you're wondering that, I think it's ready. If you're wondering, I wonder what that character should do in chapter 9, it's definitely not ready. So And I suppose my opinion of, are you going to burn a bridge with a potential fan? I mean, that is, you got to be willing to do that. So
Sure.
That's my opinion.
Yeah. So what question? Sure. Yes. What questions do you send with the manuscript? How do you get useful feedback out of these readers?
Well, first of all, and this addresses that question too, is you present it as, I need your help. So it's not an evaluation. I mean, it is, but it's like, I'm writing this book and I'm asking a handful of people for early stage feedback. Will you be that? I trust your opinion. I know that you read a lot, or whatever it is. It's a little bit of buttering up, but it's mostly just honest. It's, you don't want to pick someone who you don't trust and tell them that you trust them. So you should choose people who you trust. And then an example of a question that I have people ask is, when you read this book, how do you feel? And so that is a kind of a question that you can't answer it wrong. It also doesn't require a person to give any sort of, professional sounding feedback. It's not about what could I do better, It's not even an opinion. It's just, how did you feel? And so people they feel allowed to say, I was a little lost, or I loved it, or, got me fired up, or I was mostly happy, but I was confused. And so those are, to me, sort of side doors into, really honest, helpful feedback. Another is, what part is your favorite and why? So again, it doesn't require any professional understanding of how books are structured or anything. It's just, what did you like? And it will be very revealing what people say, and also why. Is the book too long, or is it too short? That is a very general way of asking, like, am I rambling? Did I leave anything out? But if you ask, did I leave anything out? It's kind of an intimidating question. Is anything missing? How would they know? They're not the expert. They didn't write the story. So some of the phrasing of the questions, I think, is just making it, does this feel too long to you? So those are the types of questions that I like to ask that are side doors into candid feedback. And it's good to know, I think, before you bring in an editor, because if one person tells you it's too long, well, you can sort of brush it off. That's their opinion. But if 3 people tell you it's too long, as we all know, that's when you start to realize, like, okay, maybe it's too
long. Right. And then, do you coach the writers through using that feedback and changing their manuscript, or what guidance do you have for putting that kind of feedback to use?
I've never had the beta reader feedback in the way that I'm describing break anyone's spirit. It always
good
makes people thoughtful and lends a sense of value to the manuscript. So I've seen, like, really brutal, as far as, like, brutally honest, like, really cutting, hard to read feedback. But I position it before working with editors for that reason, because then if you get feedback and you don't really know what to do with it, well, then you take it to your developmental editor. And if you get feedback and you are like, oh, that's what I should do, then you can do a rewrite. And so that's basically what I do with folks. I'm not a nuts and bolts writing coach myself. So I do this with people who have a first draft manuscript in a way to sort of do a litmus test for themselves. Like, how is this going to play with some people that I trust? And if it plays pretty well, you still need to move on and work with maybe an editor. But maybe if you get a certain kind of feedback, you need a substantive editor more than you thought. Or maybe you need, maybe you need to write another chapter, or maybe there's a gap that you weren't aware of. So you need to do a little more writing before you start working with a professional and paying money. And so usually I keep what I personally do with folks at a pretty high level, just because that's the role that I play. But usually I tell folks to take this feedback, sit with, address any issues that are themes, things that are in more than one person's feedback. And a lot of times it is not so much that it's largely positive, but that it's at least neutral. And so, okay, take it to, now it's time to begin the editorial process, because now you need a professional, or you would benefit, of course, from a professional. Let's get it moving.
If you're listening to this podcast, you are probably a writer, and you've maybe heard me talk about the Storyworks Reading series. It is the new branch in the Storyworks family tree. It is a literary journal podcast. That's right, a hybrid, a literary journal for your ears, with a print anthology at the end of the year of the best of the podcast. I am open for submissions, and I want to see your best prose right now. I am taking both fiction and creative nonfiction. You can read the guidelines and submit your work at storyworkspodcast.com/submit. What are you waiting for? It's time to see your stories published and sit on the other side of this microphone from me. Have a conversation about your storycraft. Right. Kathryn, have you ever put a manuscript in readers' hands in this way in the early stages, not in a peer group, in a writer's critique group, but actual readers? Have you ever tried this?
I have. It's terrifying.
Ooh, how'd it go?
Yeah.
Really?
Well, it's one of those things, right, where you hand it off and it's your baby and you're like, oh, it's so, like, here you go, enjoy the journey. And then, it comes back and they're like, yeah, so I enjoyed some of the journey, and you're like, okay, great. But no, having those questions, and I've heard, some advice about having open-ended questions and just letting them kind of express before. And those questions that you were saying just make a lot of sense, like having that format, because it does help to kind of focus what it is they're reading for too. And if there's not too many, they can hold them in their heads and they can be like, okay, was this a fun, was this fun? Did this give the attitude that the author wanted, And so it's like, okay, I can follow that through. And I've done this for some friends too, some first reading kind of stuff. And it's fun, honestly, because you get to help without having to feel like you said, I don't have to be your editor. I don't have to know exactly how to fix it or help you with exacts or, anything like that. I don't have to be prescriptive. I can just say, I struggled with the middle. It wasn't my favorite, but I really liked your climax, and so those are the sort of things that, like you said, it makes you think in a good way. It turns that creative cap back on rather than like, oh, I'm done, which can be kind of a mental block. You can kind of go back into, okay, still a work in progress, still, going through it, and keep yourself in that creative process, which is very both fun and also like, oh my gosh, I have to rewrite this thing, depending on how long you are writing.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah. In your experience with this, Kathryn, are there pros and cons to giving the manuscript at this stage of the game to readers versus to a writing group for peer critique?
I have never had a writing group function for me in a way that was good. So I can't really speak to that entirely. I think it's easier almost to hand it to someone who is dedicated to just reading the whole thing, rather than a lot of times in a writing group, you're giving little tiny pieces, right? So then you get, and again, depends on the writing group, but like a lot of that tends to get a little prescriptive. I would do it this way, or I would do it that way. And with this beta reader process, you're handing it to someone who, may or may not be a writer. And in fact, a lot of times when people are reading my stuff, they aren't writers. And that's kind of the feedback that I want. I want to get that just gut reaction. I want more. This was awesome. This character is my favorite. And then, it drug through the middle and I didn't really finish it. Or once we got to this part, I didn't get the point. That's the kind of stuff I want so that I can play with it, rather than, well, you used 17 adverbs in chapter 2 and it really slowed down the pacing. So you should go in. And I'm like, okay, great. So, but again, it depends on your writing group. It depends
Thank
on
you,
how
adverb police.
Exactly. It depends on how it's all structured. So there you go. There's my experience.
Yeah. I think that highlights the pros and cons really well of the reader feedback versus the peer feedback. I have found sometimes I'll let someone I'm very close to read a manuscript, and they think because I'm a writer, I must want them to step it up and really critique and really tell. And I'm like, no. That's my job. And that's really my job. So you don't have to do that. Just tell me what you liked, what you felt. I want your emotional reaction. I want to know how it moved for you, how engaging the characters were. So yeah, they can definitely be different animals. You can get a writing group where people get it and they know not to be fixers.
Yes. Yeah.
But, yeah, it happens.
The writing group, the having some guiding questions basically is really powerful, and making it focusing, like you said, like you both said, focusing on the reader's opinion, and definitely not the fixing.
Yeah. So what about the ARC readers at that stage? If it's going hand in hand with the proofreading process, are your clients still planning to make a change after they get feedback, or is this more of feedback to help them target the right market, the right kind of reader?
Yeah, I wouldn't. Once we send out ARCs, we're not changing the book at all. Maybe if there's a typo and we have time before it goes to print, but I would view, usually, like I said, the ARCs are going out roughly when we're doing the proofread. That would be ideal. So they're not necessarily super clean, but they're pretty much ready to go. Sometimes it's after the proofread. But the function of sending out the ARC for me is reviews. So, and I'm a big Amazon proponent because so much of book buying happens there. So I really like to create that ARC reader group. So this is marketing, but it's also, I think it's just respecting your book, really respecting what you created, because the reality, when people used to go buy books, in a bookstore exclusively or predominantly, that's why you get reviews from a newspaper or a journalist or something. And then you put them on the back of the book so that when you pick up the book, it's not just the book and what the author says about it. It's the book and what some people that you trust say about it. And so the disadvantage that you have if you're publishing on Amazon or anywhere online is that, well, you can't really look at the back of the book. The back of the book is the reader reviews. So to me, that's how I use them. I think of it, well, this is just respectful to this thing that I just spent a year or more on, is I'm going to give it to 20 people in 6 weeks, 8 weeks in advance. And then I'm going to ask them to just put their honest opinion on Amazon the day that it comes out, so that when hundreds or thousands of people that I don't know come and look, it's not just the book and no one's opinion. I want it to be the book and like 3 or 4 or 10 people's opinion, because that's just how that functions on that platform. So I think of it in that way too. It's sort of it's self-respect. So I think of the ARCs in that way. It's less about changing the book, and it's more about like presenting the book in a strong way.
Yeah. So how can we, as writers, incorporate reader feedback without falling into traps? I mean, we touched on needing to be ready to take feedback, being emotionally ready for it. And, you mentioned some of your clients will give their book to 5 or 6 people and say it hasn't been read. They haven't fulfilled their promise to me. What other, what are, I don't know, both ways we can use that feedback and pitfalls we might face that we maybe haven't touched on yet?
Well, I would be very interested to hear from the two of you about how to leverage it. In my experience, the main thing it is getting over that hump. Like Kathryn said, it's terrifying, and it is. It's terrifying to send your book to someone, and so the personal process of moving through that terror, 6 months or more before your book gets published, as opposed to moving through it when your book gets published. I talk to people about that. So it's less about what people say, and it's more about choosing, just like being on board with this idea that this book is, I'm writing this book to publish it. I'm not writing this book to like mess around on the computer and go talk about it at the bar, so that is huge. I mean, there are volumes of books written about that. So I think that conversation, and I'm a publishing guide. So like if somebody's not taking it seriously and they balk at this idea, that's a red flag for me. And I find it's very freeing. It's very freeing for people. So I talk a lot about that, like just doing this and learning how to process this feedback is really valuable. But then, and learning that people are going to let you down. That's why like with the ARCs, it's a preparation. Like you have to ask twice as many or more people than the number of reviews that you're hoping for, because people flake. We all flake on each other. It's crazy how we do this. So that's just real. And it's not personal. So those things are big. And finally, just learning how to learning how you personally deal with feedback helps you work with editors better. If you got a bunch of feedback from these people that you personally trust, you're going to understand I get really angry when I get feedback that it isn't loving, or I love it. Sometimes it'll make people more interested, or it'll make them be more thoughtful about, oh, well, I want an editor who's like this. This is the kind of, so those are the kinds of things that I like to highlight with people. It's really less about like, did they like it? It almost doesn't matter what they say on one level, although it does matter a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I'm a big, your internal process is so crucial. So I talk about those aspects a lot. And then I guess I pass off.
Yeah, that's interesting.
How do you change the manuscript to the writer or the future editor? So I didn't think about it that way until your question. So that's pretty revealing right there.
Yes. Yeah, I like taking a look at this issue from the side, the more emotional side and the writer preparedness side, because we can, in today's world, stay behind the curtain. You can write a book and put it up online and kind of disappear, or you can build a website and do social media posts, but it's not like you have to travel across the country and stand up at a podium in bookstores and have your face and your voice and your sweaty, shiny forehead because you're nervous or whatever in front of an audience. You can just kind of live behind this curtain. And then if you do that, you might not develop the resiliency to take the feedback that comes when you put something out into the world. It's great when you get positive feedback, but even a great book isn't going to get all positive feedback. It just isn't. And those can certainly bruise the ego. I think I think one thing we've touched on, but it bears repeating, is the idea that, if one person says they don't like something or something was wrong with the story, you can probably dismiss it. Don't dismiss it automatically. Look at it, assess it for yourself. But if you get that feedback 2, 3, 4 times, it's time, no matter how much you love that part of your story or that character or that passage, it's not working. So you have to cut it or fix it. And as an editor, I'll have clients, they all meet with me for free before they hire me. So they get a sense of what they're getting with me. But sometimes I send someone feedback and then I don't hear from them for a week. Yeah. And when we get, when I track them down, they say, I had to like digest, they're like, oh, overload. Because it's a novel. It's a whole book that I'm giving feedback on. It's not like, right. And other clients are like, bring it on. Yeah, I love it. Be tough, be brutal, give it to me. And you get the gamut. So I like what you said about the writer taking this feedback and figuring out who they are and how they're going to work with an editor or with whoever is next in their author's journey as they develop this. Kathryn,
like a prep run on
yes.
one level.
Yeah, it is. All right, Kathryn, I'm going to toss it to you.
You're going to toss it to me.
And Amelia. Yep.
I will say,
how do you incorporate reader feedback?
Yeah, I will say, on one hand, it energizes me, right? To figure it out, to fix the problem, to fix it and solve it and move on. And like, on the other hand, it sometimes feels very overwhelming. So it's good, I think, for me to have big overarching, like, this is what I need to do. And then also to have the nitty gritty. So I have to sit with something like, if Alida gave me feedback, I'd have to sit with it and then break it down into, okay, here's the next step. Here's the next step. Got to have a to-do list, right? That's the way my brain functions. So I think knowing yourself, this process to me just feels like one more step in knowing yourself and knowing what your process needs to be and how many readers you should be sending it to and, where your editor needs to land and all of these things in order to best work with your mental capabilities, which sometimes are not what we wish that they were, and to be able to deal with that anxiety and or ability to move forward or need to sit or relax and work through it on your own terms and your own time. So I think, again, knowing yourself and your own process is so important.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. I really like how this conversation is highlighting the holistic approach to this issue and to being a writer. And it's not just mechanical. It's not just break down these story elements and talk about how to of craft, but it's, look, you're a mental, emotional, spiritual being, and this book is your baby that you're preparing to come out into the world, and that's a big deal.
Very true.
Yeah. Any final thoughts on this?
My final thought is the questions. So if anybody out there is considering this, it's important to ask half a dozen specific questions, because that way you tell these beta readers or early readers, this is what I want feedback about, and it frees them up from feeling like, oh, I have to sound smart about everything, or I have to fix things. And it also allows you to ask, if there is a part of it that you're just not sure how it lands, you can just ask that and get some feedback before you dig in one way or the other. So the questions are really guide the experience on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great advice. So, Scott, where can our listeners find you?
Oh, yeah. I am scottjamesconsulting.com. And so I do
Excellent.
my publishing work there, and that's where you can find me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us on the roundtable.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Are you ready to take your storycraft to the next level? Storyworks Fiction Online School has courses available right now, from micro courses on character traits to master level workshops on plot and building characters. There are also live workshops with your instructor in the classroom with you every week, guiding your progress and workshopping your manuscripts along the way. All students enrolled in Storyworks Fiction, whether active in a class or not, can take advantage of the monthly free live Q&A calls with Alida. Check out storyworksfiction.com today and take your storycraft to the next level. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.